Yeah, the next talk is a little bit something different, right? It's a talk by Marcel Potziot. But I have to say up front, he couldn't make it in person today because he has been sick for a whole week actually, and he didn't feel good enough to travel. If all is well, he will be here via call after the talk to answer some Q&A as well. But he actually sent a recording of his talk. He's talking about MCP, which honestly I don't know much about. So I'm really curious.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing more from him on what that is, on how to actually build something with PHP in that space.
Exactly.
And I think it's one thing for people to talk about AI, try all these different tools. But I find it exciting to see people in our PHP ecosystem really kind of moving this forward and making sure that PHP is a part of that conversation, that it's clear to PHP developers what are the tools that we're supposed to use in our ecosystem to replicate to some of the results I've seen elsewhere, and to then build on those and explore further and actually improve and advance in that AI space using PHP. So I'm really looking forward to Marcel's talk.
Exactly. Now, before we switch to Marcel here, I'm looking at our screen there, and I just noticed that one elephant over there that's a little bit different than the others, and I'm so looking forward to.
Nope, that's the wrong side. Come on, there is.
But we're keeping it in the background for now, and I think that's for later today. But for now, we're gonna switch to Marcel, who's gonna talk about MCP, and he's gonna do a little bit of introduction as well. So enjoy, and again, you can leave your questions in Discord as well. If Marcel isn't able to make it in the call, then he can scroll through it afterwards. So we hope that your question will be answered. Anyway, here's Marcel.
Hey, welcome to my talk about MCP servers with PHP, what they are, how we can use them, how we can build them. My name is Marcel Potziot. I'm the CTO at Beyond Code, where we create software tools for PHP developers, people like ourselves, people like you. If you want to follow me on social media, feel free to do that on all kinds of socials using that handle. And at Beyond Code, we create tools such as Tinkerwell, which is pretty much a GUI for a PHP REPL. So it allows you to quickly evaluate code either in your own local projects, in like a dummy Laravel project, or you can even connect to remote projects via SSH or using Docker and Kubernetes. Then we have built Expose, which is an open source tunneling solution. So it's kind of like Ngrok. So it allows you to share your local URLs via a remote site. Then it gives you a publicly accessible URL that you can then use to test webhooks and stuff like that. What's really cool about this is, as I said, it's entirely open source and it's built entirely in PHP using React PHP, both the server and the client. So feel free to check that out on GitHub. There's a lot of cool stuff in the code there. And last but not least, we are maintaining and developing Laravel Herd, which is the easiest way to get started with PHP on your Mac or Windows machine if you want to set up a full new development environment with a lot of useful tools that help you debug and test things faster. All right. So we're here to talk about MCP. Now, before we go and check out any code and look at how we can actually build servers, we first have to define what MCP means so that we then have a good understanding of, well, what are MCP servers in the first place? What do they do? What purpose do they have? So MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. So let's first go through each of these abbreviations so that we see what they actually mean. So M stands for model. This means that the MCP, like this protocol, can be used in combination with an AI model. It can be any kind of model, so it could be a video generation model, an image generation model, audio model, but it's most widely used as of right now with text generation models like large language models such as GPT-4o or the Claude ones, or, well, any kind of LLM. That's where they are most useful. The C is pretty much the most important part. It's for context. So LLMs and the prompts that we give to them require context. And depending on the tasks that we ask an LLM, they're simply not capable of doing them on their own. So if we have a prompt that looks like this: check out my WordPress backend and ensure that all posts from my Excel sheet are online. Now, if we only provide this to an LLM, it will not be able to come up with what we want it to do, because it would need to connect to a WordPress backend. It would need to somehow read an Excel sheet, then compare the results, and then get back with the results for us. And that's kind of where MCP servers come into play. So if we have a prompt like this, we pass it to the large language model, it would need to access the WordPress backend and the Excel sheets, and the MCP servers provide context to the AI model. So they kind of sit in between the LLM and the actual implementation, like the actual Excel sheet or WordPress backend or whatever. And they, well, basically act as something that gives more context to the large language model. There are a couple of available context types that are defined in the MCP specification. The most important one being tools and resources. And depending on which MCP client you use, so this would be, for example, the PHP Storm IDE or Claude Desktop, not all of these context types are being available at the same or even in the first place. So as the standard is pretty new, this changes over time. So first one would be tools, which basically allows the developer implementing the MCP server to provide any kind of tool. So you can just basically build the implementation that should be called as this context type. So this can be an API call, fetching something from the file system, things like that. Then we have resources, which, well, are just that. They are just static resources. So for example, our Excel sheet would be a resource that we can then add to our prompts or to our responses and requests in the MCP clients. Then we have prompts and sampling. Those are not really used as of right now, but they are defined in the MCP protocol. We are going to focus on tools and resources for now. And this is basically the flow, how it looks like if you interact with an MCP client. So as I said, MCP client would be PHP Storm, for example, or Cursor, VS Code, Claude, Desktop, anything like that. And when you add a prompt in there, it's going to see which MCP servers are available, use the tools and resources that are available. These tools and resources themselves handle the logic on their own. So for example, they access a WordPress backend or read an Excel sheet from the file system. Then they get the information back, give it back to the MCP client, and then this will be passed to the LLM, where the AI model can then do with those results whatever they need to do to provide response to whatever was the query or the input. There are a couple of MCP clients out there. And if you're somehow a bit aware of the whole AI space, you might see that new ones pop up every now and then. So as I said, these are IDEs or like desktop tools. So anything that can interact with these MCP servers. And last but not least, we have the P, which stands for protocol. So this is basically just the definition of how the MCP server and the MCP client communicate with each other. In this case, it's an JSON RPC protocol. So this means that there's a defined protocol in JSON format in which the client sends messages to the server and the server then sends messages back to the client. And there are a couple of transports available. Transport basically means that, well, these are ways that you can start your MCP server. So if you want to start a local MCP server, the default one would be the standard input, standard output transport. This means that when the MCP client, your IDE, sends information to the server, it's just going to write it into the standard input of a program. And then if your MCP server wants to send back information to the client, it's going to write it to the standard output. So, for example, like an echo call in PHP. And this works fine for local MCP servers. But there are also transports available that allow you to host MCP servers over the internet or over local network, which is really cool. So this one would be server send events. So then instead of calling just a single program on your computer, you would just access the MCP server via a URL. And then when the client connects, it's going to open one connection, and then via server send events, the messages get passed back and forth. And last but not least, there's WebSocket support as well. I haven't really seen WebSocket transport being used that much yet, but it's defined in the specification. So it's definitely possible, and it somehow reduces the load on the server compared to server send events. So it might be useful if you want to build something that you want to make publicly available. All right, so now we know what MCP stands for, how clients and servers interact with each other. How can we actually use them? Again, this is all pretty new, so there's no real definition out there that all clients use in the same way. Right now, most of the configuration happens in JSON format. So if you want to add an MCP server to Cloud Desktop, for example, you would need to add it to this JSON object configuration. But I saw that in the latest update from VS Code, they also added the ability that VS Code plugins allow you to basically ship an MCP server, which is really interesting. Okay, so then you can basically define a command. In the example of the WordPress server, it would be npx. Then you provide arguments, and then you can provide environment variables to further configure the MCP server. All right, now once that's added, you can see the MCP server and all of the registered and available tools, for example, here in Cloud Desktop. So we can get access to the get post method, we can add posts and things like that. And well, just to show you basically an example, here I have added this to Cursor, to Cloud Desktop, write and publish a blog post to my local WordPress installation. So it found the add post tool. Then I have to basically approve the tool usage. We can see the parameters that are passed to this tool. And now the MCP server automatically published and posted a blog post for us about PHP's 30th birthday. And well, there it is. So this was all just by connecting the WordPress MCP server with Cloud Desktop, and then just this one-shot prompt, which I think is pretty cool. And like that, you can just add more functionality into tools like Cloud Desktop or other IDEs. All right, so much about the theory of MCP servers. But we're celebrating PHP's 30th birthday, so let's see how we can actually build an MCP server on our own. So there are a couple packages out there that that do this for us. I'm using the PHP MCP server package because I think this one solves it really nicely. So you just compose or require this in your application. So for example, let's say that you want to add some MCP server functionality to your own application. So you want to expose more functionality, more tools to MCP clients. So you just require that package. And then I just added a class. Right now it's called fetch downloads. And what it does, or the idea here is basically it retrieves the number of herd downloads and then gives it back. So I could ask the MCP client how many downloads herd has. So this is just a class and a public function count. And as you can see, this count function makes use of the MCP tool attribute. And within this attribute, we provide a name called fetch downloads. So this is just the, well, kind of internal name of the tool, the one that the MCP client sees. And now what's really cool about the PHP MCP server package is that the information in the doc block is also being parsed and made available to the MCP client. So here the MCP client would see there is a tool called fetch downloads. The description of the tool would be retrieve the number of herd downloads, and it knows that this tool returns an integer with the number of downloads. And then inside of the method, we can just do our own implementation, our own logic on how we want to return and handle our tool. Okay, so like that, you just define tools. It's just public methods on classes. And then to actually start the MCP server, as I said, the standard in, standard out transport is basically just a program that reads from standard in, writes to standard out. So you can just copy paste basically this file from the MCP server repository. What we do here is we create a new server instance, give it some server information. And then the MCP server package has something called discovery. So we can just give it a directory, and then the server is going to scan the directory for tools and resources. So everything that has the appropriate attributes attached to it will be made available. And then last but not least, we define the transport and then listen for standard input, standard output. And now whenever you run this single PHP file, your MCP server is running as well. So in order to use this within, for example, Claude Desktop, what we need to do is, similar to the WordPress example, we need to add it to this JSON file inside of the MCP server's object. We define the command, which would be PHP, and then as the argument, it would be the MCP server PHP file, the one that I just showed you earlier. All right, and that's it. And now when I ask something like, what's the download code count for herd, Claude Desktop knows that there is a tool available, so it doesn't need to, I don't know, search the internet or something like that. So I get this prompt that Claude would like to use an external integration. You have to approve it, which is a good thing. If it would just happen automatically, that's not really that good. So you have to approve it, and then we get the result from whatever the tool returns. What's really nice as well is that you can also provide parameters into your methods. So let's say that we don't just want to return the counts, but we want to return the counts for a given platform, like Windows, Linux, or Mac. So by just adding this add param doc block, we just basically notify the MCP client that this tool accepts a parameter, which is a string, and then the description of it will also be passed to the LLM so that the MCP client knows what to pass to it. And well, then we just use the argument as we normally do in PHP. Now, if we perform the request again in Claude Desktop, and I say something like, what's the download count of herd on macOS, if I click on the approval screen on the tool, I can see what kind of parameters the MCP client would actually send over to my MCP server, which makes it easier to debug to find out which parameters are actually being sent. So in this case, the platform would be set to macOS. All right, so this is how you define tools. Now, what about resources? So as I said, for example, like an Excel file or something like that. Resources kind of work the same way. So you just add the MCP resource attributes to a public function. And resources need a URI and a MIME type. So your URI is basically the identifier of this single resource. It needs to be in this URI format. So this could be file, it could be, I don't know, content, database, anything. So in this case, we just have the latest YAML file, which has a MIME type that we define as well, which just, again, aims to add more context to the MCP client so that it knows what kind of content it gets back and what to do with it. And then inside of our method, we just return the content of that single file. And well, as I said, the different MCP clients handle this differently. So in Cloud Desktop, for example, it does not automatically discover which resource it needs for a specific task. So you have to explicitly add it. So here we can see that we have the PHP MCP server and the WordPress MCP server available. I can click on add from PHP MCP, and then I get all of the available resources, and then can just click on them to add them manually. But again, this is probably going to change so that sooner or later, these MCP clients will just detect which resource can be used or should be used for the given prompt. And just as another example, this one was using the WP settings from the WordPress MCP server. I can just ask, what are my WordPress site settings? It reads out this resource and then gives me information about whatever is stored in this resource. And well, that's how you would then build your own MCP server. So it allows you to register custom tools. It allows you to register custom resources, and then you just add it to your MCP client, and then you can start using it. And this is really powerful because it allows you to, well, add context to your MCP client that otherwise would not be available in the first place. So you can use this to access stuff from your own backend. So if you're using Laravel, you could use like a Filament backend MCP server to read data from the backend or perform certain actions that are usually just available for the administrator if they click around in the UI. And yeah, this is all that I have. I hope this gave you a good understanding and introduction of the MCP server, the protocol itself. If you want to check out the MCP package that I used, you can find more on that on the GitHub repository for PHP MCP. And thank you very much.
Hey, Marcel, how are you?
Hey. I'm not sounding as much as Kermit the Frog. While I'm saying that, I still kind of do. So if there's one thing I learned, it's that camping at a metal festival when you're 40 years old doesn't get easier.
So it was a metal festival. We got a question about that. Adrian here asked, did Marcel attend Nova Rock or is he sick? But you were also sick, right?
Well, yeah, I guess it happened both. I was at Rock am Ring camping there, and I guess I got sick there. Yeah.
Marcel, we're all getting a little older, basically. That's yeah, and we need to adjust, just like PHP. Well, but we should select PHP is getting better the older it gets. I feel like we are just like,
you're not getting better.
It's
what?
Like
I'm going the downward slope, unfortunately. Marcel, thank you for still like recording your talk yesterday and making that effort. Really appreciate it. And it's an interesting topic, right? MCP?
It is, yeah. And I mean, the whole AI space is moving so fast.
Yeah.
But like as you said before the talk, I think it's really important to see that PHP is involved, and well, also to just like explore the space and see what we can do with this.
I'd love to follow up on that actually. Like, I mean, you showed us these examples with WordPress. Are there like any other fun experiments you've done? Like anything you practically use this for on a regular basis already, or kind of like where are you on like making this a part of workflows that you have?
Yeah. So the MCP servers that I use, for example, just Googling stuff or browser automation itself is really cool. And then just more internal tools. So just exposing functionality that I only have access to in my backend. Basically, like, I don't know, have an MCP server tool that allows you to refund orders, for example. Then I can just do that in my IDE and let the tool handle this for me. But I'm also exploring this with Herd, because I think this is just a powerful combination of having like a PHP development environment and then combine it with, well, kind of exposing tools of your local sites. Like there's one cool thing that I didn't mention in my talk. The MCP server can also dynamically add tools. So you have like these predefined tools, but you can also define and add tools at runtime and then notify the client, hey, there are new tools available, which I think is really powerful. So as you are working with different projects, then kind of the IDE can detect that new tools are available depending on which project you're on and things like that.
So do you see this like, you know, thinking ahead a little bit, is this just a standard thing that anything that has an API today will also have an MCP server? Or like, do you see this as a slightly different kind of approach to accessing some kind of software system?
Well, I think it will eventually lead to something like that, where every kind of API will lead to an MCP server. I'm not really sure if that's going to replace an API. But so, for example, I saw Paddle using this in one of their demos, and it was kind of a marketing demo, but it was still pretty cool that they basically had an MCP server for their Paddle API, and then in the IDE, you could basically spin up the whole payment flow and let the MCP server create like products on the Paddle backend and change pricing and things like that. So I think it just streamlines the whole development if you can do a lot of things just in your IDE and let your IDE communicate with APIs for you. I think that's really cool. But I guess it also depends on what APIs there is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on one side, the fact that a lot of things have APIs today, and then like having AI on the other side, and like it really seems exciting to be able to kind of finally connect them together, right? Like kind of seeing a way where you don't have to rebuild everything to kind of work with AI, but that maybe there's kind of like a middle ground where we can just connect these systems together, right? And that's kind of what MCP turns out to be.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, also for reporting, like you don't have to manually dig through JSON array structures to figure out some reporting because the AI can just do that.
It's like it's a whole other way of interacting with code in a much more human friendly way, or at least that's what it felt to me. Like, for example, you gave that example with where you passed in the platform to the function, right? And someone in chat here asked as well, like, can I ask Cloud Desktop in the example which platforms are available based on the doc blocks, for example? But I think you mentioned that is in fact the case, that it reads like all the metadata as well. Yeah,
the MCP client gets information about the available tools, which is the description, the parameter description itself. So you could ask questions about the tool. Yeah.
But I think maybe leading back to PHP a bit more, like in your experience building some of these things, like how have you found the tooling so far? Like, has it been like, you showed us PHP, MCP, the GitHub work, and that seemed to be working fine. Like where was that a lot of effort involved and things kind of not as like well documented yet, or were there incomplete parts? Or are there things that, we need to focus on and make it easier for more people to start working with this?
I mean, as usual with any kind of open source project, documentation is something that people can just jump in and help improve. But I felt like the whole thing is so new that there are like a lot of competing packages out there. Like the other day, someone on X said that there should be like a PHP leak package to unify these things, which I think would be a great idea. So I think it still comes down to figuring out which package will win, so to say. And then
make it more of a coordinated effort, is what you're saying?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And on the other hand, with all these different MCP clients, it's still like there are so many things that only Cloud Desktop supports, and only these, like this specific part of the protocol is only supported in Cursor. Like there are so many things, and they change all the time, that it's kind of hard to keep up with which part of it should we focus on.
But I think that's like an important thing to keep in mind with this. Like there's so many news stories right now about like this new thing, like this AI thing here, this AI thing there. This is all really early and new. And while yes, there are some people that are advancing that field, it's, you know, like if they do something with some other programming language, that doesn't mean that somehow PHP is too late or something. Like it's early days. I think like if, you know, enough people in the PHP space get together and work on this kind of tooling, like there's a very real probability of PHP being one of the choices that you work on these types of systems with. And I think especially on something like MCP servers that were specifically now with the remote capabilities made to interact with classic web applications and not just some other kinds of systems as initially.
Yep. Yeah, I think, I mean, if we want to add, like logic to MCP servers that lives in our PHP applications, we should write the servers in PHP itself.
I had one more question, Marcel, from Discord here, because this was on the back of my mind as well. Like, is there a risk in using MCP servers for company project repositories? Like, source code must be protected and make sure it will not be used by any other AIs, right? Are there any certainties here?
Well, it's kind of like you have to know which kind of servers you're using and kind of trust the author, I would say, because once you approve the tool, like this approval screen that you had, the tool can just do whatever it wants with whatever the LLM gives it. Like if there are some tools that require as a parameter private information, the LLM might just give it to you without you knowing it. So you would need to at least trust the author, check the MCP server code a bit and like click as long as the IDE allows that, click on the actual tool calls to see what actually is being sent to this third party. Because even though it runs on your local device, it is a third party that kind of accesses your code.
I mean, in lots of ways, it's the same way as if you're installing some PHP package, right? You kind of want to make sure that before you execute that code, you at least trust the authors or whoever you got this from. And I think this is no different than that.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, Marcel, there are a couple more questions in the chat. I don't know if you were able to follow the previous talks, but I'm inviting all speakers to go into Discord and read through their thread because we don't have the time to like discuss all the questions here on stream. It will also be a bit better for your voice, maybe, to be able to write instead of talk. But there were also a lot of people wishing you like to get better soon. So
Thank you.
I wish you that as well, and I really appreciate it that you were able to make it here. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Thanks for the insights. Really, it's challenging, right? It's a new.
I think it's exciting mostly, and I look forward to seeing a lot more and kind of like the real use cases that people come up with, like that this ends up being super useful for. Really, really looking forward to that.
All right, Marcel, with all of that being said, thanks for joining and get well soon. See you next time.